morning.
Good morning, good morning. My name is Jennifer Dom,
And I'm Darlene Rebel.
and we are excited because we have our coffee and it's Grief Talk Wednesday. We are so excited because the topic today is about what is the difference between trauma and grief. And we love this chat. We love this topic because this will be fun. So if you have your friends who are available, please let them join, share our link, invite them because we'll be talking about the difference between trauma and grief. And before we go any further, Darlene is gonna share a quote.
Okay. So we've all gone through traumatic events. None, as we've said before, we're all 100% grievers. We've all had some kind of loss or some kind of trauma in our life. So we're just going to share this quote. And it says, grief is like living two lives. One is where we pretend that everything is all right, and the other is where our heart silently screams in pain. So lots of times, I don't know if you connect with this, but lots of times I know in my life when I've had grief, right? I pretend everything's okay when I'm really in a lot of pain. And so this just is a great quote. Let us know if you relate to this quote, if you've ever experienced or felt this about grief. And grief can come from all different events that happen. And so we're going to talk actually about trauma and grief and give you definitions so we know what's the difference between trauma and grief. Trauma, PTSD, all those words are floating around and lots of people are using them. So we just wanted to clarify just what's the difference between trauma and grief.
I love it. Darlene, thank you for sharing this quote. I love it so much because you know what? How many of us live two lives? Like how many times do you meet somebody and you ask them, how are you doing? And they say good. However, inside they're screaming of pain. I have been there. I have been there. And that's why today we're here to just share with you, our friends, about the difference. So please give us a thumbs up if you're watching and what you think about our quote. Do you ever say you're good and inside you're silently screaming pain? I am one of those. Sometimes that happens. And so we're here to connect with you because Darlene, and you can tell us more about it. When we scream pain and we act like all is well, what is the impact for that?
The impact is usually disconnection, right? We can't be present, we can't be real. We put on this fake, right? We put on this mask, but it's not who we really are. And so you can't live in two worlds. So you have to disconnect from one. So you either disconnect from the pain, although it's still there, and try to be somebody else. But in the end, you're not being true to yourself and you're not being honest. We talked about being emotionally honest. And when we're not, then that leads to that disconnection. It leads to that feeling empty, right? Or not knowing who we are.
Right. Oh my goodness. I love that, Darlene. And I encourage everybody who is watching today at this Grief Talk today, if you're screaming inside with pain, please connect with us. Please DM us, private message us, and we'll give you resources because we've been there. And at Grief Talk, we do share lessons learned from life and loss. So, what's the difference between trauma and grief? I love it so much. Did you know trauma is an event? Who knew? So, and this event actually causes a lot of harm, whether it's mentally, emotionally, physical. And it can be death or abuse. Do you know when you think of trauma, we think of, like, Darlene, do you have an example? Like when you think of trauma, what do you think of? If it's an event, what are we talking about?
I think we often think of like war or like seeing somebody die or right, we actually trauma, probably a lot of even PTSD started in the war with veterans, right, when it was used to describe how how they felt when there was killing all around them, when they were unsafe, where they had loss of control, where they loss of trust. So I think that's how trauma started. Abuse is another huge one, whether it's physical, sexual. Abuse is a huge trauma in people's lives, because it changes, right? They have that loss, that huge loss, and it's a traumatic, right, event, and it impacts it. It's the one that we can't get out of our mind, that we keep seeing and seeing again, or reliving.
I love that. So a traumatic event could also be called a loss event.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about loss, not just loss of a loved one, loss of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to read this because I love this. Whether you want to call the event trauma or loss is okay, but the result of a traumatic event is grief.
Mm-hmm.
Who knew?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you think maybe you lose trust on somebody. Maybe you lose there's any loss. Like let's think about any loss, and it's a traumatic event, and we think,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's just trauma. However, we don't connect it with grief.
Mm-hmm.
The traumatic event results to grief.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we know that grief is a normal and natural response to loss. It's the conflicting emotions that result at the end of or change of a familiar pattern or behavior. So, grief is a feeling of wishing things would have ended differently, better, or more. Grief is a normal and natural feeling after trauma. Who doesn't, when something traumatic happens, who doesn't wish that it had ended differently, that something had changed, right? We have those thoughts. If only I had done this, then that event would not have happened. And we often blame ourselves, and take responsibility for a traumatic event.
I love that. So most times, so let's give another example of trauma, darling. Like if you witness a dog being hit by a vehicle,
Mhm.
that is trauma,
Especially when it's your own pet.
right?
Yeah.
So do we relate that with grief?
Not usually, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what we are saying today, any traumatic event results to grief.
Grief. And when your dog dies, it doesn't actually matter how your pet dies. It's still a loss event. So whether it's a traumatic that your dog got run over, or whether it's your dog dies of old age, right? It's still a loss, and there's still grief attached. So we still, no matter if the event is trauma or not, we still have that core is still grief, and we still have to work through that grief.
I love it. It's so, this is kind of a heavy topic.
Mm-hmm.
However, we feel it's very important because we don't know the difference of trauma and grief.
Mm-hmm.
And what we are saying is that traumatic events results to grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we all avoid the word grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we share all the time that we are all 100% grievers
Mm-hmm.
because of these traumatic events that happen in life.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our life, there will be trauma happening all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's our mission at Grief
Mhm.
Talk and the work we do. We want to normalize the word grief and know that it is part of life.
Mhm.
And anytime you go through trauma or a traumatic event, it results to grief. What are your thoughts, my friend? This is heavy for me because, like, there are things that have happened in my life, and I'm like, no, I'm not grieving. However, as we are saying, the traumatic events results to grief. So, how do we deal with that? And that's why we do grief recovery method. We work with our friends who connect with us in regards to this. We share about how to complete this grief. Because what happens when we don't deal with the traumatic events which results to grief, that's when we start screaming in the inside with pain,
And while we're saying we're okay on the outside, right?
right? And we are not okay
Mhm.
because we are hurting inside.
Mhm.
And so and when we are hurting inside, when our inside is screaming with pain,
Mhm.
we want to numb it because we don't want to feel it.
Mhm.
So what are the things that we do? We intend maybe numb it with some prescription, numb it with a glass of wine, which results to a few bottles, numb it with different things because we are screaming with pain and we are living two lives. So, Darlene, help us understand what can we do? What can we do to deal with that pain? And like, where do we get resources? Because now we know the difference between
Trauma and grief.
trauma and grief.
Okay.
I love it.
So the first thing we need to do is calling grief what it is, grief. When we can acknowledge that it's grief, then we can go forward. So recognizing, so first we have to call it grief. And sometimes it even helps. Like, I know I've been talking to people and they're telling me this experience and how they're feeling. And I'll say, oh, that sounds like grief. And they're like, yeah, I never thought of it that way. So we need to call grief what it is, grief. We need to recognize that grief is a normal, natural reaction to loss. There's not something wrong with you. You aren't going crazy. It's a natural reaction to loss. And then we need to learn the series of actions that lead to recovery or completeness from loss. So those are the tools that we're talking about. So if you are in a community, again, find a certified grief recovery specialist in your community and work one-on-one or in a group program. So we have in our community, we have a couple people doing grief and recovery loss. We do groups. Our next group is starting in October. We're going to do another group. So we'll do groups about 3 times a year, and plus we have individual sessions for grief and loss. So again, find somebody who does grief recovery. And the other thing you can do is buy the book. So the Grief Recovery Handbook is an awesome tool. I know we give them out as we do the course. We give them, people each get a handbook, and they've been handing it to other people, and other people have been picking it up and reading it. And what's good about the Grief Recovery Handbook is it talks about all the myths, all the things that we've learned that don't work, and then what does work. So those are kind of the basics that you can do if you've experienced trauma or any kind of loss, and want to find how to process, how to be happy again, how to not live those two lives, how to be able to be present and be able to work through your emotions.
I love it, Dali. I love how you shared that. I was looking down because I'm interrupting today. We need to find a way to interact without looking down. However, we love this topic so much. This is our mission to share with you about lessons learned through life and loss. And guess what? If you'd like, we have an ebook that we can share for free to you all. Please private message us your email address or email us, and we'll send you a free ebook that talks more about the difference between trauma and grief, because our mission is to help and connect with you so that we can live one life instead of double lives. Because as you saw the quote, we all say I'm good, and we are screaming of pain inside. To live fully, to love our loved ones, our friends, our community, we don't need to live two lives. We need to deal with what's screaming inside us. So until next week, please let us know your thoughts. Let us hear from you and connect with us. And don't forget to get your copy of the ebook in regards to the difference between trauma and grief. Thank you.
Goodbye.